this panel, we have Ken Newby, James Nixon, Green Guthrie, or something like that, Ashal Kapoor, and Ashal will also be keeping time for the speakers. On opening government, we have Kate Allegation. Opposition, we have Hart House C. In this intercontinental debating competition, I'd like to call upon the first speaker of opening government, Becca, to open it.
When we look at the way that cyber attacks have evolved throughout the years, and we have reached a point that the state has clearly failed to protect this individual. That's something abhorrent and heinous because we stop them to protect from themselves. And in most instances, these firms are the victim of the ideology that the state in itself propagates. And that's why, at least the moment that we cannot provide and ensure the security exists, we need to extend our obligation and let them do it by themselves. I'm going to argue this debate on the two fronts. Firstly, I want to talk to you about why states should not do it, and when they do it, why they don't want to do it, and why they shouldn't do it, and why it's better for them to outsource it to these corporations. And secondly, I want to talk to you about the tangible outcomes that it will bring and why it's necessary for them to do that. If I have time, I will talk about how this would incentivize more hackers to come up from deep dark web and join these firms, which Mustafa thinks is not necessary. But the first premise of the debate, right? Why governments should not do that? No thanks, right? See, we think the moment that government do that, they come and look at the way that United States of America and CIA has rejected to cooperate with all these firms. Well, because of reasons, because they are afraid of North Korea. Like, I mean, like, it's Kim Jong-un, he might just go out there and says that United States government actively is participating in a direct attack against us. So it would empower the rhetoric and becomes a national issue, meaning that the possibility of national innocent civilians who have nothing to do with that particular case is going to be beaten. We think if we outsource it to corporations, a state at least have the opportunity or the rhetoric to say that this is not something that is in our best interest, this is not a direct attack that the United States nation is doing against North Korea, but it's something that a corporate is doing itself to protect the nation. So we think if the government do it by themselves, it breeds more harm. It's better for them to not do it. That's the reason that they are reluctant. That's the reason that they don't want to engage with it, because there are so many geopolitical consequences that they are not willing to engage in at the end of the day. But more importantly, the moment that government have access to those information are classified information, and the use that the government has used. So dissemination of those information is not in the best interest of the government. So even if the government has access to it, these patterns will only be known towards some particular areas, but not everything that is necessary for them to know at the end of it. Before I go through and talk to you about the necessary consequences, I think I'll conclude.
If a firm's overseas interests are inhibited by an attack, would you also be okay with them using physical violence to respond to that attack? And if not, how is this different?
No, we are not allowed to use physical attacks because we think when it comes to cyber war, it's something more sophisticated, it's something more complex, and it's that's clearly there. We are talking about instances that people use concealed identity, people use dark web. If you want to go hit someone in the face, you have to go in front of them, and police is going to catch you. It's not as easy as that. This is a different context, and we hope you are not going to do it. Right? So, what is the consequences? First, we think we have talked to you about why the states do not have the interest and incentive to share this information for us. But we think this information is super crucial for you to know, right? We think it's important for you to have access to those information because you can understand the sort of sophistication and the nature of the network that has penetrated your system at the end of it. And these are the information that is crucial to you to know at the end of it. The way that the system works, the way that they have used you, and the way that they do. I think it's important for you to have access to the identity of those individuals. because the state cannot publicly disseminate and shame them or tell them that, oh, look at this guy who's the guy who's been hacking everyone. But as a friend, you might have an active interest to go out there and show and demonstrate and share the identity of this individual at the end of the day. I think even if a state can do that, they are not incentivized and they are reluctant to do so. Even if they don't want to do it, someone has to do it. Someone has to disseminate the identity of this individual to create the sort of natural chicken to stop them from going ahead and further harming individuals at the end of the day. I think, right? Second, I think the very reason that we retaliate is to damage those particular entities. We understand that this might not be as sophisticated as a war, right? But this is still a sort of sophistication and infrastructure is necessary and is needed for them to have access. The moment that a state cannot control an active threat to your active interest at the end of the day, you should be there to stop that threat. You should be there to limit and restrict the threat that exists. We are talking about these individuals who can go shamelessly and hack you with no reason, right? They can, damage your capacity as a firm to make more profit and damage your capacity to further grow at the end of the day. So the moment that a state has failed to protect your profit, the fundamental reason that you can exist and operate as a firm, you have an interest to go ahead, to damage them and to make sure that they are not as capable as they would be under the rule of a state at the end of the day. So damaging them is something necessary and something. That's the same reason we fight terrorism in my blog, my theorist, and that's why the spot to stop. I said we should do it. Before I go and talk to the last alternative on Hong Kong.
Speaking of profit margins, fishing vessels lose profits all the time in the South and East China Seas as a result of the actions of foreign fishing vessels. Would you allow them to physically attack each other without the permission of their state? And if you wouldn't, why would you allow them this discriminate?
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna give the same answer I gave to first. It's different, guys. Yeah. It's internet. It's internet. Oh my, it's internet. We don't have guns. We cannot shoot people on the internet. Okay, you need to come here and tell me why internet is the same as actual life works, right? Okay, so lastly, the thing this would create a deterrence to any random search, right? For we have Lord say or any other people who do this out of excitement. Like you're talking about teenagers who know how to use internet. Even when it comes to the context of North Korea, the thing North Korea is less likely to do it under our because they can have access to visual information. So if North Korea, they do and go and attack Sony, now they know that Sony is actively going behind their back, chasing them, and they're gonna try to screw them over at the end of the day. So this is sort of check and balance and the deterrence, a sort of regulation that does not exist at the moment. Lastly, sorry Musa, we think there are a lot of good talented hackers who hack out of excitement because that's a challenge to them at the end of the day. They want to do it just for fun. They don't want to cooperate and they want to be limited to the frameworks of the way that network security works. Under our policy, now you're going to incentivize them to further join your friends, to actively operate in something that is necessary as good for it. What have we proven to you in this PL speech, right? We prove to you that the states are reluctant, they are unwilling, that's unjust, and but you still have an active protect. Even if they do it, that's something harmful and it's better comparatively to happen on the offline. I gave you 3 outcomes. Firstly, the necessity of having access to those information. Secondly, the necessity of damaging those individuals. And lastly, I'll talk to you about the deterrence that exists on the offline to protect them. And lastly, I'll talk to you about my beloved hackers and how they can have proper jobs on the offline. We are very proud.
Yeah!
I think that's for that speech, and I would like to welcome the first speaker for Oxford, Tasha. Greetings today, and first thing today, coming from number one is the fact of making waging war from the US acknowledged why it should be allowed to wage war, and it being the internet is not a response. Secondly, about why this affects also major outside war and things like traffic lights. Secondly, the danger of vigilantism and how the fact that cyber was covered means that loads of people will be screwed over by this because their IP address will be being misused and their petitions will be crashed and so on. That is bad. And thirdly, about why, in fact, having large private armies of hackers and encouraging that is really a good thing for board teenagers. First of all, however, a bit of rebuttal, most of it, however, is integrated. Now, one of the final points that we got, that hackers, like, loads of board teenagers will now be employed. Ladies and gentlemen, the NSA is the largest employer of mathematicians in the US, right? There are loads of jobs for people who want to be professional hackers to work for the man. The point is, groups like Anonymous, etc., don't want to work for capitalist corporations and don't want to work for the CIA or Langley or whatever, right? We don't think that changes under our model. You need to demonstrate why they want to work for corporations. And B, if these like people who are currently totally related to crime having reason to enhance their skills, they could say. Secondly, corporations have been interested in it to their interests not defended. This is effectively half my question. But I'll deal with it now. So, they gave us a series of reasons why states are better placed to make decisions about whether to respond to hacking attacks. So the states are embedded in a community of knowledge, right? They have a wider sense of what their geopolitical interests are. They have access to private information about, for example, how a state will respond, what the wider interests of their state are. So, for example, if you attack China and the Chinese respond, and it's not, by the way, only non-Muslims attack, that potentially implicates a lot of other US economic interests, right? That is more likely to be damaging to corporations because it harms the wider state, right? Corporations do not have that kind of privy knowledge, and therefore in a bad place to be aware of how to respond to it. Secondly, we say that we don't think that corporations, even if they are defending their own personal interests, right? And the point is, what we say is that it harms wider state interests, and corporations do not have the right to inflict a wider cyber war on the rest of the population. We think people come before profit under this situation. Okay, moving to that now to my substantive note, thank you. Okay, so what we see is that there are three forms. Number one, there are states who can be on the most prevalent group because they have the capacity for large-scale cyber attacks on incredibly complex corporations. Secondly, we say there are other corporations, particularly in states such as Russia and China, who are the largest, basically hacking armies of states. They are often corporations that are controlled by states. Thirdly, we say private actors such as anonymous, although we suggest that there are minority cases, because as you say, there are often teenagers who don't move quickly and want to do this. Why is it appropriate under all circumstances? Okay, so the US has not explicitly stated out as many other states in the entirely domain of warfare. Like, we don't allow the waging of aggressive war under any other circumstances, because we recognize that what most people recognize to be an act of war is A, generally implicated wider sets of state interests, right? We do particularly when these responses are directed against Chinese state entities or Russian state entities. Corporations doing it is going to be seen as a tactic condoning of other states performing these acts. Why is this? Number one, because there is a failure to prosecute, for example, because they did even extend the spotlight to states never doing this, essentially probably still do for cyber attacks. In not prosecuting or tacitly accepting it by not, for example, condemning or implicating. Secondly, these corporations and state property is highly interrelated, particularly in state culture where corporations are indeed essential to state when they're heavily funded by the CF, large numbers of Chinese petroleum projects. Thirdly, it's very attributed to these states often corporations are often attributed. For example, right, it's empirically the case that US corporations extensively collaborate with US security entities in things like data sharing. It's like the design of their software, right? The CIA currently has cyber keys in the backing of large numbers of their corporations. Despite that not being a legal requirement, right, it's therefore very clear to us these corporations are in link with the US, or even if they aren't, for states who regard the US with suspicion, or indeed other states like not the US, but all the Five Eyes states who are the main subject of attack. It looks like they are, and that's what's really important, right, is that misdirection, misperception means that consistently this will look like attacks condoning by the state. We think the states have a good reason not to ignore these attacks, because they realise that sometimes responding to the Chinese and creating an escalating of warfare is not an appropriate thing to do. We say often if there is not to condemn or respond. At the point, however, at which there are a series of responses from corporations to this, states where these corporations are housed are put in a massive corner, right? Either they have to openly condemn it, in which case we can suggest that A, it will be ineffective, and B, go through the common motion. Secondly, ineffective for the reasons which generally like implicated and just duplicative, as is frequently the case in the US. Secondly, if they don't condemn or remain silent, effectively they reveal their cards, but they are talk about these networks. Willing or not, we think that this direction is quite important in terms of states not knowing what each other's interests are, being able to mislead each other in terms of foreign relations or political POS about how they want to get on.
I think you need to be comparative, right? Because the alternative is either doing nothing, which I think doesn't provide sufficient deterrent, or cyber warfare, which will be much more damaging politically.
Okay, no, we think that not doing something is sometimes the appropriate response, but you don't want to provoke states, e.g. the Chinese and Russians, into an escalating series of attacks. I'll deal with now. Number one, you can get these attacks, it looks like tactics condoning, you get worse relations. Secondly, you get active punishment from the responsible state. These states are often very driven on a tit for tat basis, and if you get one destruction of a corporation, you'll get another response back. What this does is, at best, this cripples corporations, which is huge the economy. At worst, it does things like a response against the wider state, because they look like they're implicated with the rest of corporations. Thirdly, even if you just get a response against corporations, they don't buy state stuff, right? What you get is number one, corporate punishment. Secondly, you get things like attacks on associated stock points. So those, for example, things like traffic lights or electricity, which state corporations are highly reliant on, because corporations advertising will probably build to sort out their defense mechanism. At that point, it has a hit not only on corporations, but on wider American or other state interests, and on other people. You need to demonstrate how my corporations can implicate innocent bystanders in a series of escalating cyber warfare. Let's be very clear, right? These attacks are not sudden and random. By the way, US just responsible for it, just to decide. These attacks are not sudden and random. They're regular. Every single day they happen to train and test software. What this means is that you go back and forth, which normally every single day are ignored. You get it every single day. And what you get is an escalating attack of greater and greater aggression, rather than ignoring what is considered low level, low harm, soft point probing. So what you get is not just like unresponsive to cyber warfare, you get escalating bad cyber warfare. He's absolutely right. You have double find at 7:50, so thank you very much. I'll sit down.
Thank you for that speech. And now I'd like to welcome the next speaker for GPU, and that is Mustafa.
It's hard to simplistic for the leader of opposition to come up here and tell us that we suffer no harm from the continued cyber attacks against us. It is rather unfortunate that you do not recognize the sort of security breaches that Saudi has to suffer, which, by the way, implicates a significant number of innocent bystanders. People who play PlayStation in the audience, you obviously were not very happy when your credit card information, when there was a significantly large amount of access to your financial data and personal information that then becomes harmful. So the fact is, harm is eminent and existent and only continues to exacerbate. Do we sit down and keep quiet because of potential political ramifications that happen either way because Russia and China don't like you regardless? Or do we then respond in a manner that allows us plausible deniability, but more importantly, we've always in the past, as the United States and other Western nations, kept quiet and gotten away with it when private actors have acted on our behalf, on behalf of our interests. Why? Because international pressure plays a significant role when it comes to ambiguity. When China comes up and a corporation has responded to Chinese attacks on an American corporation, it is difficult to stand up against the US in public and say it is the US's fault, especially when the US can easily come up and say, no, you attacked a private corporation. That private corporation responded in a proportionate and appropriate manner. Therefore, the US's public image remains intact. As much as China is rogue, it also maintains a certain degree of a need to maintain legitimacy in the international community. Likewise applies to Russia. That's why Putin was not that much of an asshole when he came to Crimea, because he could have taken it if he wanted to. But he had to bow down to a certain degree of international pressure. And we tell you that's the check and balance that we have to do. But now let's deal with the biggest harm that they have. Well, then you're essentially endorsing physical violence. No, we don't. Why? Because there are obviously crystal clear laws when it comes to the regulation of issues of indirect physical violence or direct physical harm. In other words, if a fishing vessel in the waters of the South China Sea was attacked, there is clear legal recourse for us to respond because there is a clear breach of sovereignty and security. But when it comes to cyber warfare, where there are no crystal clear lines as to what is cyber warfare, there's no crystal clear lines as to where the lines of security are drawn. And where the state has failed due to political ramifications, we think corporations have the right to protect their own political interests. Let's cover the case from the beginning, but quickly.
Okay, so you say that there are no crystal clear laws. Would you like there to be clear laws regarding internet conduct? And if those laws do emerge, do you still support the distinction?
Yes, we do, because once again, cyber warfare, even if you do have laws, the degree of harm is usually very ambiguous. In other words, states always take a political stance when it comes to cyber warfare, and we find that highly problematic. because it's difficult for states to argue that it has an interest in Sony. In other words, her whole argument about how the state is perceived to have a certain stake in big American companies becomes a lot more exacerbated when the state actually acts, when the state formulates these sort of laws. And that's why the state doesn't act, because it does not want itself to be perceived to have a significant vested interest in corporations that could potentially become part of a physical war if you do choose to do so. The reason why Apple is not involved in the process, and the reason why we don't respond when Apple is attacked, for example, is because you don't want Apple's facilities abroad to be attacked. You don't want to involve them in the physical war, and that's why you don't want to be perceived to be having a vested interest. That's why the state only acts where it's personal, direct, crystal clear properties are attacked, and that's where corporations should act on their own. But let's address the speech before me, and then move on back to Hart and a couple of new things that happened to you in this debate. So primarily, her biggest issue, as you mentioned earlier, was physical violence and how, well, it is bad for hackers to exist in labs. So we tell you, no, hackers exist either way. Hackers will have the sort of employment you have either way. But this is a larger, greater, more regulated avenue. Why will hackers not regulate corporations? Because corporations obviously have an interest in maintaining public image. The moment anybody finds out that you're hiring a bunch of hackers to randomly attack private citizens and screw up their IP addresses, nobody's going to like you. But more importantly, their whole question of power grids and soft spots was contradicted in the conclusion of her speech, when she said that these soft spots are tested and hacked every single day. Considering you're faced with the reality of direct, consistent attacks on these facilities, the best way is, as Becca told you, you're not just hacking them to retaliate, you're hacking them to collect data on these individuals. You're hacking them to target their facilities, therefore crippling them. So unless you can prove to us that sitting down and keeping silent will in any way deter these individuals from acting, or in any way reduce the magnitude of harm, it is unfortunately difficult for you to win this debate. So, a couple of things. Let's first talk about what Becca talked about. We'll get back to big war later and how we're part of a much bigger war, and therefore these small actors are crucial in the process of protecting people. First, Behar told you it is obviously a lot more important or good for the state, because the state does not want national liberty. What does that mean? I think that makes very clearly to the beginning of my speech, where I told you the large political ramifications of explicitly attacking North Korea become difficult when it comes to international pressure, and the fact that it's easy for them to run rhetoric. You must respond to the fact that China can easily run rhetoric and say the US is attacking state facilities, and that becomes very difficult for us when it comes to negotiations and leverage. Yes, the US is not the best bastion of human rights or morality, or even being the most appropriate in wars, but we think it is important to maintain a certain amount of implicit value in the US always having the superior ground, always being able to point out to China and say, you are the one that attacked. The response of some corporation that was protecting its own interests, not from the United States of America as a state. We think it is of great value. But he also told you how the tangible outcome is ultimately to protect citizens and individuals from being harmed by these direct cyber attacks. They've unfortunately failed to respond to that. So let's talk about big war and the separation of states. We tell you that we are part of a massive war where the state wishes, unfortunately, we have to bow down to state wishes. And corporations, at the end of the day, when it comes to public interests, have to bow down to state wishes. We know that there's a difference between direct competition, like that occurs in waters, where because I got 50 fish, you got 30 fish less. That is one thing. But the other aspect is when there is a direct aspect of an attempt to harm your financial interests, where it's a direct negative political motive to attack you. How do we disincentivize this war from descending onto corporations and keeping it within the political sphere? The only way to do that is for corporations to stand up for themselves and say, we are not with the US. We don't care what the US's financial interests are. We are corporate entities with financial interests that must be protected. When the US keeps silent, when corporations remain silent, it means the US, or it sends an implicit message that the US has done something to protect these companies, or has bribed these companies to keep quiet and not act on their behalf. Why is that problematic? That is problematic because putting these corporations within the wall only makes things worse. It makes them hot targets and continued hot targets for the cyber war. We are okay with attacks on the state because the state always acts in that instance. When it comes to corporations, it is important for corporations to make a stance, and the state to allow them to make a stance. They are not part of the political process. They are private entities that, if attacked, will retaliate proportionally because we don't care about politics. With that, we are proud to propose.
I thank Mustafa for that speech. Now to close off the first half of this debate, I thank Alban Patrick.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The idea that cyberspace is the fifth domain of warfare has been around for quite a long time now. And during that time, not a single credible US military general, CIA director, nobody has ever advocated for this model. Because it is one in which you dramatically escalate the risks of a global configuration involving cyberspace, one in which power grids, which already have a dormant virus in them, called flame virus, you dramatically increase the risk that those power grids get shut down by a rogue state. You dramatically increase the risk that traffic lights do get turned off, that banks get shut down. You bring down an entire economy. Those are the implications that we're talking about. What I'm going to bring you in my speech today is three things. First of all, why we think this makes the world a much more dangerous place for innocent people. Secondly, why we think that this is bad for corporations that I think should be responding to this. And finally, why we think that this is wrong in principle. So firstly, let's talk about how this makes the world a much more dangerous place. We point out in the point of information that this is analogous to the South and East China Sea, where you do have commercial legal bodies, commercial legal vessels ending up in physical altercations all the time. So thank you both. And according to their own logic, would appear to have some kind of a right to respond. The reason we don't allow that is because it dramatically increases the risk of a confrontation. One in which sides miscalculate, one in which without state permission, one in which without public costs being taken into account, you increase the risk of warfare taking place. That is why it is analogous to any other domain of warfare in the case of cyberspace. Because cyberspace is identical, right? The same principles apply. We think that what happens is corporations are fundamentally unaccountable. If they make a miscalculation, they are accountable to no one. In the case of the state, they are accountable to taxpayers. They're accountable to the people whose lives could actually be compromised. You don't have that in this case. We think that it's likely to be a disproportionate response. They say that we were inconsistent to point out the fact that attacks are happening all the time. It's not inconsistent. There are attacks happening all the time on corporations. People are constantly trying to monitor data. People are constantly trying to test systems. So thank you. The point is this. If a corporation responds to any single one of those attacks, because it has an impact on their profit margin of, let's say, at most 1% for that year, the risk is this. A state like North Korea deliberately sets it up as a trigger. They attack another corporation knowing full well that when that corporation responds, they can say, the United States sponsored this attack. And Tasha gave you analysis as to why you don't have plausible deniability. These are corporations that are embedded in the national security framework. They rely on support from US defense and from the NSA. No, thank you, Bob. And more to the point, North Korea tends not to give a shit in the first place about whether or not there is solid evidence for these linkages. So what they can do is provide to their own people and to the world at large some kind of rhetoric to say this was a response from the United States government. And even if you don't buy that analysis, we think that there's just a greater risk of miscalculation, that states actually misinterpret the attack that happened. This is analysis that Tasha gave you and that they seem not to understand. Here's another example of the kind of thing that we're talking about. No, thank you. The South Korean internet was attacked on an extraordinary scale in 2012. Servers were brought down, people's credit card details were released. It was a huge attack. And it was very clear to everybody who it was, i.e. the 3,000 large hacking army, the largest in the world, in North Korea across the border. But do you know who the virus was linked to? The United Kingdom. That is the kind of miscalculation that can happen. This is an ally of South Korea that apparently, according to the evidence, would have been the right party to attack. We think that the kind of ambiguities you have in cyberspace, the ease with which you can conceal who made the attack in the first place and where attribution lies, results in the wrong party being attacked, results in a much greater risk of a global war. And that is not something that we are willing to risk. No, thank you both, just to improve the profit margin of a particular company. They say that we can have plausible deniability, that states can just walk away from this. Slightly in tension with the idea that states then apparently can actually say, no, we think this is entirely proportionate, you attacked us. What you are literally doing is owning the attack. You were saying that this was a justified response, we will stand by it, and presumably defend that corporation if they are then attacked by the other state. You are actually directly implicating the state in the conflict that you have created. We think that that is grossly irresponsible and risks the lives of innocent people. No, thank you. I mean, you haven't even named shareholders. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and say that those are the kind of innocent people you're concerned about. We are far more concerned about the people who drive through a traffic light because it has been triggered at the wrong time. We are concerned about the people who lose their entire life savings, students, people who lose all of their, well, actually students don't know much, so we're not going to do that. But all the people that lose their money when the entire banking system collapses. When you insert just one wrong number into every 20th number, you literally bring down an entire economy. We could not be talking about a greater number of innocent people. No, thank you. That is the kind of escalation we get. That's the kind of escalation we're concerned about. We don't want also a larger hacking army. If if you have an incentive to pull a whole bunch of people into the deep dark web and pay them a whole bunch of money, you also increase the capacity of states like Iran and North Korea to hire those people, because you just have a much greater supply of these militants. We think that is really irresponsible. No, thank you. We also think that, like, the motivations of these people is also fundamentally different. As you pointed out at the start, you said they do it just for fun. We're really concerned about these people. It's fun to participate in that kind of dangerous activity, increasing number. No, thank you. We also think that this is bad for corporations. It's bad for corporations because the comparative, which is corporations providing information to states about the kind of attacks that are happening, that the incentive for them to do so is reduced, because once they provide that information, it means the state might potentially tell them not to respond.
Assuming that we have the experts that are able to bypass these identity issues with advanced technology, if Citibank's whole system is shut down, thereby crippling the American economy, and the US chooses not to act for due to political reasons, should Citibank then act, considering economic reasons?
I'm not saying, like, it's wrong that states are taking into account political reasons. Let's be clear about what those political reasons are. They don't want their entire economy to be brought down. They don't want the health system to be shut down, because all of this relies on computers. They don't want, for instance, like, radars to be shut down so that bombers can fly into their country undetected and bomb them. Those are the implications that we're talking about. We think those are political considerations are fundamental to a state's right to protect itself and to national security more broadly. And you're yet to supply us with the reason as to why profit margins should override that. It doesn't in any other domain of warfare. It doesn't according to General Douglas Alexander. We're yet to see what your analysis is on this front. We also think that, like, if corporations do this, increases the risk that a whole bunch of wacko hacks, like the people who brought down PlayStation recently, will say this is typical of corporations, typical of capitalism, and they will then target that corporation. We think that that is really bad for the corporation. We think that corporations also just can't beat states, right? Corporation tries to go up against a North Korean company, there are North Korean companies. If they try and go up against a North Korean commercial actor, they end up also taking on the North Korean government. They cannot win that battle. That's not good for the corporation. Wrong in principle, this is criminal behavior. We don't think it's right to respond to a crime by further criminality. We don't think it's right to intrude on the domain of warfare for a corporation to try and own that logic and when they're unaccountable to the wider public and to innocent people. We think also, as Fashion pointed out, because of the risk of calculation, you end up with massive corporations actually targeting totally innocent people, and we think that is also a wrong thing. For all those reasons, we are very proud to oppose this.
All right, I thank Patrick for that speech, and now we're moving on to the second half of the speech. And first off is Cape Town Aid, and that would be Williams.
Alright, so we think that this debate has become somewhat polarized, and the motion is quite clearly trying to get us not to polarize this. Okay, so the case of do we do nothing according to Ops model, or do we engage in presumably what they're trying to format this into is let's all go into cyber warfare, alright? No, neither of those would be particularly good. This is a case about trying to respond to a game that opening opposition is implicitly conceded as a game of brinkmanship. You don't win a game of brinkmanship by chickening out because you're worried about the potential for it to escalate. You respond in a way that you think is not going to result in massive escalation, but is going to disincentivize trying to pick the low-hanging fruit. We think that what's happened with the North Korea Sony scenario right now is a scenario where some states have realized that because other states don't want to engage in state-by-state cyber warfare, they can exploit that fact and go for low-hanging fruit corporations within the West that are still valuable targets to them, but don't kick off that reaction. We think we need to respond. Our comparatives that we will draw as the cozy government is that we need to devolve this conflict from the state-by-state. We need to devolve it to sub-state actors, that those sub-state actors can protect themselves, they can stop this game of brinkmanship and protect their interests, both because of our national interest in these corporations and because of their own reasons to protect themselves. That we think is the comparative. For 1 second, let me respond to some context here, because, you know, yes, OG is right, the cyber world is sophisticated, all right, granted, but we're going to present as our extension ahead of a lot of mechanisms to explain why it is that matters. First thing to point out here is that the cyber context is very difficult to defend yourself. Why? Because DDoS attacks, etc., can bring down virtually anything, which is to say that it is almost impossible to completely defend yourself in the cyber realm. The best response you have is to attack in response, all right? That is where our extension is going. Why it is that these companies need to be able to attack and respond, and also why it is that the legitimacy costs borne by various actors, state or non-state, align such that this is the best way to have the least impact on legitimacy. So let's go. All right. So the first thing is that we point out we need to increase the opportunity, the cost of opportunism. We would draw a comparative here to places like Somali pirates, all right? When they notice that trade ships weren't being particularly well defended, they notice that it's very difficult for governments to come to the aid of those ships, and they've already gotten on board with them. What was the response? We pointed to the fact that on the high seas, England goes, pick up your machine gun and shoot them, all right? What did that mean? Somali pirates got the hell off of those ships. We think that's the kind of thing we need to be doing here, where they've noticed low-hanging fruit, a vulnerable target that the state can't particularly easily defend. We need to allow them to defend themselves. They're effective at doing it, and we say that. We think that results in this opportunistic attack, which is exactly what this is. Secondly, we get leverage, all right? By being able to get data themselves in the counter-attack, what it means is that one corporation being attacked by another corporation or being attacked by a state, when they can get that information back on them, what it gives them is an immediate way to stop the information that's already being obtained and being released into the greater world web, all right? If you don't have that leverage, there's nothing stopping them from publicizing that information, which is to say the full harm has already occurred. Our policy allows the media counterattack to diffuse the situation, all right? Which is to say that now people don't start revealing all that information because they're interlinked. And that means diffusing of situation on situation. No, thank you. Third thing is that companies are more competent to do this, all right? The bottom line is, if you're in Apple, if you're in Google, if you're in Sony, you have the technical competency to defend yourself. The sad truth is that if you're not in the NSA and you don't have that competency in government, I think we can all agree we would rather not have the NSA have to get involved in that situation. Clearly, that's a greater political escalation of the scenario than a Sony or Apple's own, all right? But I'll talk more about legitimacy in 1 second. No, thank you. Third thing to point out here is the idea of the lowest costs of retaliation. If the state has to come to their defense, then it means that the state interests are also being implicated, which is to say, the ability to trade off and make them pay in other ways. We don't like the idea that you have to accept frosted trade agreements in response to having to defend your companies, all right? We don't like that. Which if the actor is the state coming to your defense, it means that those interests all align to the state, so you can make them pay with things that have nothing to do with cyber existence. Whereas if the actor who responds is themselves that company, only their response, only their interests are being directly implicated, we are less likely to see things like pulling out of bilateral trade agreements. Why? Because it's easier to dissociate yourself. And that's where I'm going now, all right? This question about the legitimacy costs, then why it's better for us to put that towards the corporation.
Respond to our analysis that the status quo is present, in which states do in fact respond to attacks, as in the Sony attack in North Korea, the US shutting down North Korea there, and prosecute members of Anonymous when they can. When they hold off, it is for legitimate national security reasons, because there's a risk of miscalculation and escalation.
Brand. Bottom line is we want to do nothing to a situation of opportunistic grabbing, all right? No, we don't think the status quo is better. We think the status quo is shifting out. What we think is that we'll continue to see these attacks, as is the status quo at the moment, all right? So no, don't just go status quo is cool. So first thing to note here is that the corporations have an interest in the legitimacy of their own strength. Their customers have just been violated, all right? Their information has just gone out onto the web. What do corporations need to survive? They need to show strength. They need to show that they can defend that information. Their legitimacy interests align with our policy. What is the question about the state protecting them, okay? Because that's actually the model you're running right now. You're arguing that the state ought to get involved, which is ludicrous given that you're arguing that's whole like, oh, we don't want an escalation of cyber warfare between states. Your POI about, oh, we get involved, we retaliate against North Korea, we shut down their internet. Your whole case is predicated on the idea that you don't want to do that. So boom goes opening up petitions, right? But let's talk a bit more now about why it is that we think that states are better placed in devolving this accountability to the corporations underneath them. Because states need to keep their public hands clean, all right? It is a lot easier for them to play the game of trying to dissociate and say individual actors within our state are protecting themselves. You know, it's not us, it's them. We're not going to get particularly involved, but we're also not going to be the ones who get blood on our hands. We were pointing to the incredible effectiveness of someone like, okay, we may not like him for what he's doing. Let's be real. Putin's game in Ukraine has been very effective in terms of muddying the waters in terms of the EU response to them. There's been far less of a response because they can't point to the fact that those soldiers there are actually Russian troops. What does that mean? It means that they've been able to counter waters. They haven't had that kind of political response. They haven't had to say, this is a declaration of war because we're putting states' troops into Ukraine. We think the same thing is going on here. When the state itself acts, which is what you sort of as you want to portray this as, all right? If they do that, then yes, that is far closer to a declaration of cyber warfare. When the state doesn't control its own actors, yes, people concede there's a political cost, there's pressure on them to keep their people in line, but that is not the same as a political response to having instituted an attack. We would rather have that response and be able to protect our interests. Thank you.
James for that speech, and now we're going to talk on the next speaker for Hart House C. Isa.
That entire closing government speech was predicated on the idea that it is a good idea to dissociate the government from corporate action because it's in cases in the interest of the government to have a cyber attack take place. They didn't tell you why a government can't just say a corporation did it or say somebody else did it if the problem really is that the government's not going to be able to do an attack that they're not going to be able to be tied to. Furthermore, I think that the government, if they want to attack, is perfectly capable of hiring the kinds of hackers that you guys think are so good, okay? We want the final choice as to whether or not to retaliate to be within the hands of the government. What they say about it, what they say about where it came from, and what they say about who did it is up to them, and we think that they're the best equipped to do that. Before I get into our extension, which is going to talk specifically about what the best case scenario, why I actually think that that is even worse for their side of the house, and second of all, why I actually think that the kinds of things that we're talking about aren't actually threats to specific kinds of security, and why responding to that ends up being worse for those particular types of threats. But let's deal first of all with closing government, because they say, look, it's really extremely difficult to defend yourself against these specific types of attacks. The best kind of defense is a good offense. I would ask them if they're also okay with people or with companies attacking if there was something easy they could have done to defend themselves. Like, I don't know, Sony encrypting their Excel files or encrypting their emails, okay? I think that there are a lot of times where companies fail to take the most basic precautions and then telling us that it is now within their right to then go and attack. That's fine. They would have to prove to us why it's the government's responsibility to go into particular every kind of company if they're being lazy about the kinds of protections that they're doing on their computer, and then attack on the behalf of that government not doing that. I think that companies ought probably have some of their own responsibilities to do those kinds of things. I think that in a lot of these instances they don't, and that's a problem specifically. But second of all, what they say is, look, second of all, what they say is that it is important specifically to show that particular type of response, because look what happened in Somalia. The pirates stopped trying to take over the particular types of ships because we carried machine guns. That wasn't true at all. The only real reason why there was perhaps not as much violence was because they started actually paying those particular types of ransoms, something that we probably think was bad. They actually didn't tell us even why that ended up making something that ends up being important. Specifically, we would prefer that companies take it into their own hands, something that's important. What do we hear specifically from opening government? They say, look, the problem is that you don't do it for geopolitical interests. The state has failed to protect you, and that is something that's important. A couple of things. Sometimes protecting one of your interests is to the exclusion of protecting another interest, okay? So if you're protecting the interest of a company to, I don't know, exist in a stable state, they might not know to the extent at which you're doing that, but that could be to the exclusion of protecting perhaps some of your profit margins of that year. We think that the idea that you're not going to have access to those particular types of information mean that you're going to make the kinds of uncalculated decisions that side opening op said you're going to. But furthermore, what I think is that it's actually a question of whether or not your corporation within that particular year is worth the kinds of security risks for that state as a whole. I think it's probably within your corporate interests as a whole. They say, look, the reason why we are okay with the cyber warfare, but we're not okay with particular violence is because it's just on the internet, the harms aren't that great. They can't get up here and argue both that the internet can be so harmful and provoke geopolitical consequences that the government would never want to act, but then also say, it's not that bad, we don't really care about cyber warfare, but we would care about people going in physically. I think that it's the same thing. I think that oftentimes it ends up being even worse. But I think what they would have had to tell you is that the corporation has the ability to adjudicate that. What are some of the reasons why they don't have to adjudicate that? I'm going to tell that to you later. But then what they say is, look, it harms individual bystanders. First of all, what they would have to prove is that there are going to be fewer casualties on their side of the house, okay? So they'd have to say it's going to harm fewer people. What we would say is that sometimes those people are worth being harmed, but sometimes they're not, okay? So if there is going to be that particular type of cyber attack, I think it's in the best instance for a corporation for an actor that actually cares about civilian life to care about that. I don't actually think corporations do. I think if they're motivated by profit margins, they're oftentimes going to make instances that might be good for Sony, but they might be bad for every other company that might be attacked in the future on behalf of that particular type of company, okay? So if Sony decides to launch a cyber attack because they're upset, yeah, they could attack the American government, but they're also likely to attack a ton of other corporations within that country, countries or corporations that didn't do anything wrong specifically. We think that that's uniquely bad. But I want to get into extension now. I want to talk about the best case scenario for their side of the house, okay? The best case scenario is that you actually get the right target. I think that there are a number of reasons why this doesn't end up being true. I think that the problem is that a lot of times the kinds of IP addresses, the kinds of routers, the kinds of encryption that we're tracing is something that the security agencies and the intelligence operations of a particular country are following. Sometimes allowing an attack to happen needs to be that case in order for you to gain intelligence that's going to protect the kinds of attacks that could happen in the future, okay? What we would tell you is that if you end up attacking, or if Sony ends up attacking on your behalf, they want to be attacked again and then launch another attack, you've lost perhaps those kinds of channels that you need in order to be able to actually understand what kinds of things the United States government or any other government is vulnerable to. I think that those kinds of responses end up being way worse. I think that you lose a lot of that particular type of intelligence specifically. I think that you're uniquely ill-equipped to adjudicate that because you don't have access to these kinds of things. And if you did, it would be because the government was probably cooperating with you or asking you to act on their behalf, okay? The reason why we don't think that they should act in that case is because they can do really problematic things. But furthermore, I think that oftentimes you're going to be acting and attacking on behalf of something that actually isn't a threat. So you're giving up the kind of, you're giving up a particular type of, like a particular type of peace or particular type of absence of cyber warfare for something that doesn't actually end up being a threat. So whether or not we actually think that the Sony attack was a legitimate threat is up for debate. If it is, we think that it's right that the government ended up acting. We think they're probably best adjudicating that. But we think there are also a lot of times where it's not actually a threat for those particular individuals. I told you that companies probably should end up protecting themselves in a particular instance, and I'll take back up now.
Ma'am, the problem is that the comparative you brought us here now is when we say there's no harm, but the chilling effect on e-commerce is what's particularly important here. Don't analyze each company in its own value, analyze them as propagators of the whole of e-commerce.
Yeah, okay, guess what happens? When you attack on behalf of the fact that Sony ends up being attacked, they're not just going to not attack other corporations. At the point at which you provoke the kinds of other attacks on other corporations, I think it probably has a way more chilling effect on e-commerce than you would like to do. But furthermore, it probably has a chilling effect on the actual like country itself, whereas we don't think that you would get that in those particular type of ways. This is problematic because I actually think that a lot of the actors that end up doing these kinds of attacks aren't even state actors at all, okay? They're Flame, they're Red October, they're Dark Hotel, things that we can't trace, things that can be done in order to provoke a particular type of attack that a country might want to see happen, okay? We think that they can oftentimes provoke an attack because they think you're going to attack another individual, something that could be beneficial for a particular non-state actor or a particular corporation overseas. We think this happens with conventional warfare all the time. I think it's much worse with cyber attacks because we think that it's much harder to trace, something that we think is specifically problematic and ought to be left in the hands of an actual company that has a back channel of tracing these kinds of things and can understand whether or not an attack is likely to be from a particular area. So on all those bases, we are begged to oppose.
I think it's all for that speech, and now I'd like to call upon the last speaker on the proposition side, David.
Right. Thank you, Madam Speaker. So what this debate boils down to essentially is a question of what sort of retaliation are we likely to see from other states, right? Because what we tell you about legitimacy is that a company should have a right to defend itself. The responses we get is that that right to defend itself comes second to third-party concerns. So concerns about whether that state is going to attack our country, concerns about innocent bystanders. What we would say, first of all, is that they need to do a hell of a lot more work on their side of the house, right? Because what we would say is that your self-defense, even if the interests of third parties is at stake, you should still have the ability to defend yourself, right? No analysis to respond to that. If it so happens that Hamas is using human shields, but they're attacking you and you need to do something about that, we think that there's like risks to innocent people, but those risks to innocent people shouldn't outweigh the need to defend yourself. If another country is attacking you, so they've got a ship and they're attacking you as a fishing vessel, they've got innocent people on that ship. We still think if you're a fishing vessel, you should have the right to defend yourself. No, thank you. No work done to respond to that idea on the part of opening opposition. So they're out of the debate, right? Maybe there'll be some work on closing. Okay, now let's get into the meat of the debate that's happened, right? The analysis to do with what sort of attacks are we likely to see? What's the sort of political game that we're playing? All right, so what do companies do? Because opening opposition has lots of concerns about innocent bystanders. What we would tell you is that companies primarily are going to try gain state information. Why? Because that gives them the ability to use that state information to blackmail the group that's attacked them in order to protect people retrospectively, right? So if, like, North Korea has stolen your information, then if you gain valuable state information on North Korea, you can stop them revealing that. So that's the primary sort of attack that we're likely to see. Additionally, what we would say is that if you're using like a DDoS attack, if you're using an attack on state infrastructure, we think the long run implications are such that we think are necessary, right? So even if there's a cost to innocent bystanders in their country, what we would say is that the long run implications where these sorts of cyber attacks are reduced means that that doesn't need to be the case. But also we think that the protection of our own citizenry, right? So this is not just about Sony, it's about the security of e-commerce in general, brought to you from closing government. Because the problem is that when you can attack the low-hanging fruit, when you can attack companies like Sony, people don't feel safe leaving their information with Google. They don't feel safe like giving their bank details when making an online transaction. That has massive implications for the global economy. And so we think in that respect, even if they're innocent bystanders that are hurt, we are happy to bear that cost. Then what they tell us is sort of a practical problem, right? That we might get the wrong people. What we would say to that is, firstly, obviously, we're not supporting attacks where we have no warrant, right? We're not endorsing attacks where there's no reliable information that points to a group like China or to North Korea, right? No, thank you. But additionally, what we would say with respect to this idea of getting the wrong person is that's one of the reasons why it's very hard for the state to get involved. Because if the state gets the wrong person, then we think that's a hell of a lot more problematic, no thank you, than when they're able to like scapegoat Sony and say it was Sony's fault. So then the retaliation from a third party state that was the wrong person is like localized to a retaliation against Sony. So I think in that respect, it's much better. But additionally, we think tracing technology is a lot better. So Flame obviously is the biggest problem for this, but we think, no thank you, that later technologies that have come about, we've been able to trace fairly reliably. And part of the reason why we haven't done that for Flame is because Flame isn't that high impact to begin with. It just like looks into your webcam, right? Okay, so now what we want to talk about is the idea of tangible state retaliation. So this is the major idea brought forward by opening opposition. They say that we are so damn scared of people like North Korea retaliating in the cyber arena that we don't defend our companies. No, thank you. Well, what we would say is that states like North Korea, when weighing up what to do in response to an attack from Sony, are going to, first of all, be very unlikely to use a cyber attack against the United States of America. Why? Because they're worried about exactly the same sort of retaliation that you're worried about, right? That's why those sorts of states aren't going to retaliate disproportionately. Closing.
Okay, I already told you that states are best equipped to understand what is best to do. If they can use this attack as leverage to get diplomatic concessions from a country, why shouldn't they be allowed to do that if that's best in the interest of all parties?
So what we would say, first of all, is that states aren't in a position to do things in a lot of the circumstances, right? So they don't actually have this option available to them. The reason why they don't have this option available to them is because the sort of escalation when a state attacks another state is a lot greater, right? The political pressure to defend your state from another state, no thank you, is a hell of a lot greater. Additionally, we think that the sort of game that states play is very different, right? Because the sort of power states have over each other is quite similar. They can both reveal state secrets, no thank you. They can both attack infrastructure. What's the power relationship between a company and the state, right? So if a company gets state secrets, that's a hell of a lot more important to that state than what the state stands to gain from attacking that company. So we think in this sort of situation where we're discussing the political power of the various actors, it's not possible for states to retaliate, but it is possible for companies to do so. And that's something we think they really need to deal with in today's debate. They talk about ideas like uncertain responses. Well, what we would say is that there is some risk, right? We're going to admit there's some risk of a crazy response from North Korea. We don't think that that risk is sufficient to outweigh what we consider to be predictable political consequences. A lot of analysis on our side, additionally, about how this is necessary to restore company legitimacy. So a state retaliation doesn't even solve the problem, right? Because largely, we want to see that companies are powerful actors in their own right. That's what we need to protect the world economy. So for all these reasons, we think the best political outcome is to sweep this under the rug, let your companies protect themselves. Very proud to propose.
Thanks, Sean, for that speech. And now we'd like to call for the last speaker in this debate and for the opposition as well, Sean.
Both prop teams seem to be rather fond of saying that based on one line somewhere in an argument, one of the op teams must be out of the debate. I think that's a lack of nuance that speaks to the lack of nuance generally running down prop benches in the ability of actors to behave in certain ways to distinguish between different sources of attacks and to create appropriate responses. The first thing I'd like to talk about is vigilanteism and the right to defend yourself, because this was the big idea running down both prop benches, thoroughly defeated on first prop, and then the subject of an attempted resuscitation by second prop. I think first opposition tells you rightly that you don't have an interest in being proportionate when you take matters into your own hands. I think it's actually rather obvious why we generally don't let wronged persons take the law into their own hands. You don't have an interest in being proportional. And as Aislinn tells you, and I'll be getting into more detail on this, you also are the least well-positioned actor to make the intelligence assumption as to whether the person who wronged you, who you think wronged you, is in fact, no, I'm waving you down, is in fact the one who did. That specifically, that's why in general we don't think that taking the law into your own hands is good, because that has an absence of due process. And we've told you how it's actually the very worst in this situation, because you have the, unlike say a physical attack that second proposition analogizes this to, it's really hard, as both sides of the House agree, to identify who is behind an attack. There is that absence. So all of the normal harms of vigilanteism are present here. So first proposition desperately tried to distinguish this when we asked them in the first POI of the round whether you would be okay with using a physical response to a harm to your interests. And the distinction they tried to draw kept changing as the round went on. First off, they give generally they give this notion of it's not as bad. As Aislinn already the internet is not as bad as a physical attack. As Aislinn already points out, this contradicts any analysis they give you about why the stakes in this game are high. But so the first thing they give on the POI is it's more complicated on the internet, and therefore it's different. We agree it's more complicated, but that's what makes it worse to be vigilante on the internet, because it's even more difficult to figure out and take the law into your own hands appropriately. Then the second, once that was defeated, the second speaker on First Government said, okay, but the actual reasons because the laws surrounding the internet are not clear. As we pointed out in a POI, if the laws become clear, this justification falls away. But moreover, we'd say the entire justification they give you for taking this the response to this wrong into your own hands is this notion that your rights in some way have been violated as a corporation when this happens. So I think they at least rest to some degree on this being clear. But finally, Aislinn told you how even if we accept their extremely expansionist conception of when vigilantism is acceptable and when you have a right to self-defense, that right to self-defense must be a last resort, and it's clearly not the last resort if it's your own fault that you got attacked in the first place. We have this constant narrative on the proposition benches that the state has failed you. They haven't told you what the state has failed to do in preventing these attacks. And that's because in the Sony attack, which is the big example that was used in this round, it was, as Aislinn told you, a direct result of their own failure to, for instance, not keep a master list of passwords in an unencrypted Excel document. So there are, which is to say that there are other less severe alternatives that we can rely on our side of the house in order to protect people opening.
Assuming they've actually taken enough security, we told you that by counterattacking, you're able to cripple the systems and collect as much information to protect your own systems. Considering these viruses are already dormant, North Korea will go rogue any day.
Okay, sure, got you. Okay, I'm going to get into the difficulties of tracing in a second. So make sure that you understand, we are now only dealing with second prop's best case, or with proposition's best case scenario. We've shown you how in a lot of scenarios, it can be solved in other ways. Finally, we got this attempted resuscitation out of second prop that, look, it doesn't matter if third parties are going to be hurt, because you just need to defend yourself at any cost. We'd say that the right to self-defense is predicated on the person who's going to be hurt having taken it upon themselves to violate your rights. They never prove to you why third parties can be hurt. All they do is appeal to the example of why it would be legitimate to attack civilians in order to get at Hamas, perhaps the most controversial and debatable example they could have possibly used. I think it's very easy for us to say, no, it is not all right to kill civilians in order to get at Hamas. And in the absence of more analysis from them, that's all we need to say. So what is specific to this particular sort of action? Aislinn told you, and we got no response, that the state is best positioned and has the best resources to investigate this and begin the process of identifying who this came from. That this undermines the proposition case in two ways. Firstly, it means that the corporation is a less good actor. But secondly, and we got no response whatsoever to this, corporate actions may undermine state efforts to investigate this if the corporation takes action thinking that the state is doing nothing, but whereas the state is actually being prudent and just quietly investigating this, the corporation can undermine it. Second proposition says, we are not endorsing all sorts of attacks with no good reason. But you can't fiat that out, because you need to defend a legal regime in which the corporation has the right to make that call. And that's a legal regime in which the corporation is always going to err on the side of sending a message, because they, unlike the state, have no interest in making sure that they don't do so when they're wrong. We've said that this is particularly unlike conventional warfare in that respect, because, as both sides of the House agree, it's untraceable. But moreover, Aislinn told you how even in conventional warfare, we've shown how certain actors sometimes deliberately instigate attacks in order to bring down a state of which they are a part, but they don't themselves like the state. We got no response to Aislinn's analysis about how this is even worse because of the difficult to trace nature of corporate warfare. What's the last thing we're left with? We're left with how Aislinn also told you that the state has that in the case of a state that is willing but unable, that state can just hire the same hackers that we're talking about, but retain control over the decision whether to instigate an attack in response. This solves any problem, the second proposition, the proposition benches give you, of the unable state. So we're only dealing with unwilling states. What is it that second proposition gives you to try and resist this? They say, yes, but states can't do that because they maintain deniability. One, if it's the same hackers, they probably have the same level of deniability. But secondly, a public policy or even a pattern of not prosecuting corporations does not give you any deniability because you've made it very clear that you are okay with these attacks. Then second proposition says, yes, but the states are of equal power in international community, whereas corporations can give one state an advantage. That's not true. States are of differential power. The United States is able to engage in different mechanisms that give it an advantage if it wants to take the more reasonable, less law into your own hands approach that we all advocate on second opposition. We proudly oppose.
Thanks, John, for that speech. I'd like to ask for one more round of